So my name is Brad Carey,
And I'm Becky Carey.
and we purchased the Book Garden, which is the local game store here in Montpelier, in January of 2020. I worked for Rick, the previous owner, through all of 2019, and I've been gaming since 2008. One of the things that I really love about owning a bookstore is that people expect me to be an introvert, which I am. One of the things that I really dislike about owning a game store is that people expect me to be an extrovert, which I am not. So I'd ask you to bear with me tonight, and please forgive me if I make any slip ups. Public speaking does not come very easily to me. There are a bunch of games that we'd really like to talk about. There are great games that have come out over the last 20 years, like Settlers of Catan, Dominion, Ticket to Ride, and we could talk at length about those. But tonight we really wanted to focus on a lot of great games that have come out over the last 5 years that not as many people might know about. So the way we're doing it tonight is we're splitting it into three categories. We have a few small games we'd like to talk about. They cost $15 to $40. They play over 20 to 45 minutes, and they're great for one or two players. They're great to take when you're traveling or camping. You can play them while you're waiting for service at the pub. They make great stocking stuffers. We also have a few medium games. These are a little larger. They take 40 to 90 minutes to play, and these are the games that kind of most games that come out in a year live in this space of kind of standard sized games. Then we have a few very large games. These take 60 to 240 minutes or longer to play. They come with hundreds of plastic miniatures, more cards than you can count, tokens. They have great narrative experiences, really dripping with theme. So they're really fun. Becky, would you like to talk about the first game?
Yeah, so the first game is a small game, Fox in the Forest. We did bring a copy if you want to look at the back of it. It's a modern design from a classic style game. It's a trick-taking card game. There are games like Bridge, 63, Euchre that have that classic trick-taking mechanic. Traditionally, it's played with a deck of cards. You pick a trump card, and the lead player starts by playing a card, and everybody else has to follow in suit. And the goal of that style game is to win as many tricks as you can. But there are a few differences with Fox in the Forest. First of all, it's a two-player game, which a trick-taking game usually is at least 4 players. This is designed specifically for 2. There are 3 suits instead of 4. And the odd-numbered cards have special powers. So one of the special powers is that you can take the lead on the next turn, even if you don't win the trick. Another one is that you can change the trump suit to a different suit that suits your needs better. The scoring is also very different. So like I said, with a traditional game, you want to take all the tricks if you can. In this game, you don't want to take all the tricks. You want to either take very few of them and be humble, so you would take 0 to 3 tricks, or you want to take a majority of them, so 7 to 10. Those 2 tricks will give you the most points. If you take all the tricks, you don't get any points. So you have to be really careful. It adds a really interesting level of complexity to an otherwise traditional game. So the scoring combined with the special powers lets you play really strategically. So you can force your opponent to take all of the tricks by playing bad cards, but you still beat them in the end because you would get more points than them. It's a great game for people new to gaming. It doesn't take a lot of explaining. It's very rules light. It's good for people who like to just sit around and play traditional card games. And it's also really good for people you meet while you're waiting for the bus, or someone you just meet and you're like, hey, you want to play this card game? It's really easy to pick up and play.
My first small game is Railroad Inc. We unfortunately did not bring a copy of this one. We're currently sold out. This is a game that popularized a fairly new genre called roll and writes. The core concept of a roll and write is you've got a board or a map. You're going to roll a handful of dice, and then you are going to draw on your board the results of the dice to play the game. So in this game, Railroad Inc., it's designed for 1 to 6 players. It's kind of a solitaire puzzle game. Even if you're playing with 6 players, everybody is just sitting with their own little board, drawing their own little maps, and there's no real player interaction. Often games will be played completely silently as people are just focusing on solving their puzzle. So the way railroading plays, you have a map that has road and railroad connections around the edge. And over the course of 6 turns, you'll roll a handful of dice, and you'll draw the connections to try and make a circuit of railroad and road connections. After 6 turns, you'll score your map, and the main way you'll get points is by how many of those connections have been put together into one circuit. You'll also score points for having your longest road segment and your longest railroad segment. There are also special spaces on the board that you will gain bonus points for using, and you will lose points for any of your lines that end up being dead ends. When you roll the dice, you do have to use all of them, even if there are some that aren't really good for your map. So you will end up with dead ends. One of the interesting things about this game is that it's a very small package, and they released it in several different versions. There's a red box, a blue box, green box, purple box, all kinds of different colors. And they each come with 2 or 4 bonus dice that give you little mini expansions. The red box, for example, includes volcano dice, which will spew lava onto the map, making it more difficult to plan your grid, and meteor dice, which will crash into the map and actually destroy segments of your railroad, which those really create quite a headache. But the thing that I really like about Railroad Inc. is that the boards are laminated. It only has the 4 or 5 dice in the box, and it comes with the little dry erase markers, and you can play it anywhere. This is probably my favorite game on our lists to take if you're going to a restaurant and you want something quick to play while you're waiting for service, or really anything. It's just a very fast and puzzly game. It kind of makes me think of almost something like Sudoku or a crossword puzzle. It's all about combining like the lines and the rows and trying to make everything fit together in a neat, orderly way. And that's
how many players?
1 to 6 players. That's actually a really good one to play 1 player. Becky, would you like to talk about your second game?
So my second small game is One Deck Dungeon. It's a dungeon crawler game where you take on the role of an adventurer, and each adventurer has stats which will help them defeat enemies and to overcome traps and perils within the dungeon. These stats level up throughout the game, so it has a very campaign-like feel. You encounter enemies or traps by opening up dungeon doors, and they're little cards. And whether you lose or win an encounter, you still gain experience, skills, and abilities that you can use to make your character stronger, so you can fight bigger and stronger enemies. The dungeon is 4 layers, and at the very bottom you meet the boss. And by the time you meet the boss, you're pretty substantially stronger than you were when you started. The art in this game is really cool. It reminds me of a lot of RPG role-playing game from video games and role-playing game tabletop games, and the abilities for the monsters kind of coincide with their fantastical um, definitions. So like the slug monsters would have abilities with like slime or poison, and they did a really good job with it. Something else I like about the art is that all of the playable characters are female, which I have never seen in a board game before, and it's even rare that 50% of the playable characters are female. So I didn't have to pick between one or two characters. I could pick any of the characters and feel represented as a woman, and that's something that you don't see a lot of. So I thought that was a really nice decision for the artist, personally. It's this is the best one-player board game experience I've ever had. It's one of the best. You can play it with one player, and that's the best way to play it. You can also play it with two players, or if you have an expansion, you can play it with four players. With four players, it does get a little long, but with two players, it does scale well. As you see, it is a tiny box. There is a lot of game in that tiny box. There's a campaign mode that you can play through as a single player, and it will give you different goals to reach, and you want to try to beat all the dungeons and all the bosses, so you can play it as a campaign, like a role-playing game campaign. The playing it single player and playing it with two players is also a very different experience, because when you play with two players, your stats are a little bit weaker. So it's a different experience. So there's a lot of replayability in that box, and there's a lot to it. I think this game is great for solo players. It's good for people who like role-playing games, and it's really good for people who like turn-based RPGs, like old video games. It definitely gives that same kind of feel.
I have a question.
Sure.
In your discussion about these various games, can you tell us if they're head-to-head or if they're cooperative?
Oh, sure.
Oh, yes. One Deck Dungeon is a cooperative game.
And Railroad Inc., which we already discussed, would be a competitive game, but really it's just a solitaire game. If anything, you're maybe trying to beat your own best score. And then Fox in the Forest is interesting. The original Fox in the Forest is competitive, but there's a sequel, Fox in the Forest Duet, which is a two-player cooperative game. It plays differently. A lot of people wouldn't really describe it as a trick-taking game like the original. They say it has kind of experimental original mechanics, so we didn't really mention it before, but there is a cooperative version for people interested in that. My second small game is Undaunted Normandy. This is a World War II game for two players. It is competitive. We accidentally brought the North African version of the game today instead of the Normandy version, which would be, I think, the British versus the Italians. The original game is the United States against Germany. So this is a deck building war game. And for somebody who knows those two genres, they might not sound very compatible, but this game does it really well. You still have a map that you're moving units around on, trying to capture objectives, calculating line of sight, and fog of war, and all of those fun things. But the way you're doing that is through a deck building game. Something like, probably the original is Dominion. And the concept of a deck building game is that you start out with very limited resources, a very small deck of cards, and on your turn you'll draw a hand of those cards, you'll play them to take different actions, and to buy more cards from a bank, which you then put in your deck, making it larger, and giving you more options on future turns. The cards in this game are interesting because each card represents a member of one of your different squads, one of your rifleman squads, your command squads, recon squads, And each card has unique art and has a name. Each card is an individual human being. And as you go through your deck and you're playing cards, you need to play a rifleman card to activate your rifleman squadron and move them on the board to try and capture an objective, for example. The bad thing is when you come under fire and you take casualties, if the enemy was shooting at your rifleman squad, then you have to go through your hand or your deck or your discard pile to find a member of that squad and permanently remove them from the game. So your ability to act is actually harmed throughout the game as you lose options. This leads to a lot of very cinematic experiences, things like you would see in some of the best World War II movies, where they know what they need to do and they just can't do it quite the way they want to. So it leads to a lot of very desperate ploys where you're racing forward, trying to get reserves there in time. It's a very tense game, but it's a lot of fun. The tactics are absolutely great, since you are from turn to turn trying to do the best with what you have, rather than making a perfect strategic decision every time. This is a great game for war gamers who are looking for something more casual than the traditional hex encounter war games, which are more like simulations involving lots of charts and tables. But this would be a better game for them to play with a family member who's maybe more casually interested in the subject matter. There are a few expansions. We actually brought one of them today, which is the North African campaign. And there is an expansion coming out this November, which allows you to play with up to 4 players or as few as 1, rather than keeping it exclusively 2-player game. That's my.
The original game is a 2-player game?
Yes, and so is the North African one. But the expansion coming out this fall allows a little more flexibility.
Can I ask you a little bit more about Wingspan?
Sure.
When I look at the back of it, it looks like squad leader to me, and I
Yes.
found squad leader had not just 30 or 40, but 100 pages of rules.
Yep. This is
And it scared me away.
Yeah. This would be a game for you then. If you.
So I want to simplify it. It's still concentrated, slimmed down version or something like that.
Yes. Yep. This provides a similar experience of the tactical gameplay, but with maybe a tenth of the rules. It's all about playing the cards that you have in your hand. You don't have the tables that you have to roll on or the charts you have to look up. You don't have to calculate the amount of gasoline that a vehicle will burn as it moves 6 hexes or something like that. It's a very simplified. Their focus for the Undaunted series is always to put gameplay and fun first before perhaps the historical
aspect. It might be an emotional cost. If I play the war game at the level of the Army of the Potomac troops in Northern Virginia.
Yes. Yep.
I don't feel like individuals, but I know that kills when big charge kills.
Yep.
But if I was playing with individual riflemen who had a name and was on for good when they got hurt,
yes,
it would be an emotional feel to it. And not intense somewhere.
that is true, and that's something that's mentioned in a lot of the reviews. Is that it can be painful when your cards are removed from the game because you've used them from turn to turn and you feel like they're real people that you've gotten to know. And it does provide that emotional aspect of war that is typically absent in war games. That might be a little too much for some people to play, I suppose, but overall I do think it's a really good game. And I think that does a good job of showing the emotional intensity of warfare. So I think that's a very good point. Thank you.
So our first medium game is Parks. And Parks is personally my favorite game of 2019. In the game, you control 2 hikers who are trekking along a trail moving toward the national parks. You can only move forward, but you can move at your own pace. So you kind of set your own pace, with the idea in mind that you do have to keep moving forward. The game is played in 4 rounds representing the 4 seasons. The first thing that I have to say about this game is that it is gorgeous. The art, it's gorgeous. The art on the cards is just phenomenal. Each card represents a national park, and they've taken artists to draw their representation of what that park is like. So, the parks that are out in the desert have really nice desert art, and the Arctic park has a really beautiful, like, glacial art. They're really, really pretty. I spend half the game just staring at the cards like, that's really nice. The packaging, and I know this is kind of a silly thing to mention, but it's even on the back picture. The packaging component for the pieces is stunning, and it's a nice quality component in the game. This game is the best neat little package I have seen in gaming. So I love that. The tactics of this game are really good. So other players can unintentionally hinder you along the way and force you to make a decision about what you're going to do next. And should you stall? Should you maybe put your other hiker on the trail yet so that you can get that one resource you want to get to? You really have to think, and you have to be aware of the board's state as you're going along. It's a really good balance of tension and relaxation, because you're just taking a walk in a beautiful forest, but you really wanted that water this turn, and Mike won't move off the water. So it's definitely a like, but it's a really great experience. I love the theme of this game. I think it really shines because you're collecting limited natural resources to go to a park that is represented by the resources you're collecting. So if you're trying to get to a park that is mostly known for the trees, you want to collect mostly trees. And it'll tell you on the card what you want to collect. And if you're going to a park where there features the water features, you're mostly going to want to collect water. So I think the theme really shines. Each player has personal objectives that they select at the beginning of the game, which tell them what kind of parks they want to go to. So you might have an objective where you want to see parks with trees, or you want to see parks with mountains, or maybe you just want to see parks that are kind of expensive. So it really, I think, changes the way you play the game. So it adds to some replayability when you're playing parks.
Do those get assigned to you? Your objectives get assigned to you?
Yep. I believe I might have the ruling wrong, but I believe you get 2 objectives and you pick one.
But later in the game, you can actually go to spaces that allow you to draw additional objectives, and you can kind of, I think again, you get to pick 2 and keep 1, so it gives you a little bit of choice as you go.
And it gives you victory points.
We were planning on writing, decided whether to go to the Grand Canyon or whether to go to the Canyon and Bryce.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. There's also, and this is a competitive game, so there is that. But there's also a solo variant, which I think is worth playing because you can just take more time to look at the cards. I think that this game is really good for people who like the outdoors, who like to travel. Our family goes to national parks a lot, so we do like to see the parks. And it's good for people who like games with the set collection because you're trying to collect resources along the way. And I think it's also a really good game for families. I know our family plays this game a lot. Like the 4 of us will sit around the table and it's just a nice way to spend time with your family. And it can even be an educational way to talk about the national parks and the national park system.
And my first medium game is Wingspan. This is one of the biggest games that has come out in recent years. Everybody was always looking for Wingspan. We cannot keep it in stock at the store. we usually have a wait list of 6 or 7 names of people looking for a copy, and for good reason. It is a really well-designed game. It's for 1 to 5 players. Something you might notice is that most of the games we're mentioning are good for optionally 1 player. That is kind of a recent trend. Most games previously did not really support 1 player, but I think we focused on that today, especially because of COVID and the fact that people have been stuck at home. So we wanted to make sure people knew that there are games out there that they can play by themselves or just their significant other or their roommate. But in Wingspan, you are working to build the best habitat for birds. You have a board that displays wetlands, grasslands, and forests. And that leads me to the first thing I really like about the game is just the components. They're absolutely gorgeous. You've got really nice like pastel egg pieces, which look like candy. There's a dice tower that comes with the game that's shaped like a bird feeder or a birdhouse, which is just a great little touch. And the dice are nice and sturdy, well-made dice. The board is really pretty, and the bird cards are absolutely gorgeous. They've got unique art. Every single card is a different bird. And each bird, whether it's the blue jay or turkey or bald eagle, most of the birds in this game are North American birds. But they each have, as I said, the unique art. They each give you a variable number of victory points. They each have their own unique needs. Some birds can only nest in the wetlands. Some can only nest in the forests or the grasslands. And they'll each eat different things. There are 5 different types of food that you can feed your birds. Grains, berries, rodents, fish, and there's one more that I can't remember. But so each bird is completely different. They'll also have a variable number of eggs that they can produce or store. And they'll each have different abilities. Like some of the hawks might actually eat smaller birds. And you can discard some small bird cards under them and score bonus points at the end of the game. So on your turn, you can take one of 4 actions. You can either play a bird card from your hand onto your board. You can take some of the food for your birds. Your birds can lay eggs, or you can draw more bird cards. And each of these actions corresponds to different areas of the board. And the more birds that you've played, the better your actions become. The birds that you've played previously, when you choose to do an action that corresponds to the wetlands, which I think is to draw cards, the more birds you've played in the wetlands give you additional bonuses when you take that action. So you're kind of building an engine where you're eventually, each action you take does dozens of things maybe, as opposed to just the one that it does at the start of the game. It actually can be a little difficult to tell who's winning this game. There's so many different ways to score points. You get points for the eggs that you have on the board, the birds you have on the board, the birds that have been eaten by your birds, and 3 or 4 other things as well. So when you look at your board, you might not have any idea how many points you are until you actually sit down and calculate them. And that actually makes this game a really good game for families that have very competitive people. Because I've had several people come in and say, my cousin is very competitive, they're a very sore loser, but when we play this game, we never really can tell who's winning or losing until the end, and then it's over. So you don't have to deal with them being grumpy with you for half of the game. Or even then at the end, it's okay, you lost, but we'll just start another game. So it's a absolutely fantastic game. Great for bird lovers. It's a little complex because of the different scoring mechanisms and the complexity of the engine that you're building. So I don't know that I would suggest it for novice gamers. But if you've played even a few modern board games like some of the other ones we mentioned today, then I would definitely recommend you give this a try, even especially if you're a fan of birds in general.
So our third game that's in the medium category we want to talk about is Horrified. It's a little bit of our honorary spooky season game, because it is about a town being terrorized by the classic Universal monsters. So Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Wolfman, the Invisible Man, the Mummy, and the creature from the Black Lagoon. To start, 3 monsters will descend upon the town, and you and your team, which is everybody that's playing the game, have to work together to defeat the monsters and save the town. What I really love about this game is that all of the monsters have a different win condition. So for Dracula, you have to find his 4 hidden coffins around the town and destroy them. For Frankenstein's monster and his bride, you have to catch them, educate them, and get them to fall in love before they meet each other and destroy the town. The Wolfman, you have to find the cure and cure him. The Mummy curses a player, and you have to break the curse and entomb the mummy. The Invisible Man, you have to just find evidence that he exists and then trap him. And then the creature from the Black Lagoon, you have to navigate the river, and you have to find his lair and destroy him. So it's super cool. I think it's really thematic, and they did a really good job capturing each Universal monster as a unique monster. Even the monsters even have unique skills and different movements. So the creature from the Black Lagoon can attack you from the river, and the Invisible Man is obviously invisible. You and your team have to move around the village, rescue villagers, collect items, and avoid the monsters while working towards defeating them. You can scale the game to make it harder by adding more monsters. So, like I said, you start with 3, but if you think you can handle the challenge, you can try to take on all 7 monsters and see how it goes. So I think that's a really cool thing about this game, is that like it can be as easy or as hard as you want it to be. If you're new to gaming, you can even start with 1 monster and see how you can do with that, and kind of add as you go. They do suggest you start at 3, but if you've got little kids, you can start smaller. I think this game is like the board and the pieces and the art itself it's really good and thematic, and I love the Universal Monster movies, like the classic horror, and so it really appeals to me, and I think they did a great job with it. It's great for people who like classic horror movies or classic horror movie buffs, and it's also really good for people who like cooperative games, because it is cooperative and you're working together. So certain people will have skills that they're better at. Maybe one character is better at dealing with Dracula than they are dealing with Frankenstein. So it's a really cool game, and I really like it, and it's perfect for spooky season.
How would you compare it to, say, Pandemic?
So for this one and Pandemic, were you gonna say something?
No, go ahead.
So this one I think is a little simpler to understand, because the monsters' win conditions are a little less complicated than the whole board of trying to save the world in Pandemic. I feel like the monsters are a little easier to deal with than in Pandemic, where you're trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to get my player here in North America over to Africa to deal with that outbreak that's about to happen. Whereas this board is smaller, like there's less spaces to go. You can move around this board easier than you can in Pandemic. And I think the theme is it's just this is a more fun theme, whereas I think Pandemic right now is a little sensitive.
It was more fun 5 years ago.
It was
Yes,
more
yeah.
fun 5 years ago.
I would say that Horrified would be great for anybody who enjoys Pandemic. It's a similar enough experience, or similar enough play style of moving around, cooperating, and trying to solve objectives, but it's completely different. Instead of the same objectives and same mechanics every time, it's completely dependent on which monsters or which combination of monsters you're facing. Games will be different back to back rather than Pandemic, where it's all just kind of what order you draw the cards in, and so on and so forth. But
It looks just cheerful, like it doesn't take itself too serious.
it's very silly. It's very fun. There's actually a sequel coming out later this year, that is based on American monsters or cryptids like Bigfoot, the Mothman, the Jersey Devil, Chupacabra, and I think a few others. And I'm hoping that they'll do even more games in the series in the future, because I would love to see classic 1950s sci-fi horror monsters like the Blob, or they could do anything with it. It's just a really fun system.
I'm looking forward to the cryptids.
Yep.
I'm super excited for it.
So my number 2 medium game is Azul. And Azul is one that I might have a bit of a difficulty talking about. It's kind of an abstract game. I'd say it's for 2 to 4 players, and I think it's our best family game on our list. We've never played this with anybody who has not enjoyed it. It just has great mass appeal. The gameplay is just really fun. There is a theme. You are artisans trying to build a mosaic for the King of Spain, but the theme doesn't really matter. It's not really a big part of the game, other than the fact that you are playing with beautiful tiles. The art, on the other hand, is probably the best part of the game. The tiles and the board look great. The tiles, I mentioned earlier that the eggs in Wingspan look like candies, but these also look like candies.
Those look like the 2-year-old wandering around the house.
Probably not good for a 2-year-old. No. So the way you play this game is that there will be piles of these tiles. Yeah, it's on these little coasters, and they'll be randomly placed there. And on your turn, you can choose to take all of the tiles of one color from any coaster, and then the rest will go into a discard pile in the middle. And then once you take your tiles, you'll line them up in this little these holding areas, which have fit either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 tiles. Once all of the tiles have been taken from the coasters, and then the tiles have also been taken from the discard pile, you'll go to the scoring phase, where any row that you've completely filled, you get to score. You'll take one tile of that color and you'll move it into that row of your mosaic. This gets a little challenging because each row and each column can only have each color once. So again, this is kind of puzzly. I mentioned one of my earlier games was kind of like crossword or Sudoku. This also has a feeling of that. So at the end, let's see. Oh yeah, so another great thing about this game is that it has a second side on the back of the board, where it doesn't lock in which tiles you have to put in which places. So you can organize them however you want, and it's a much more challenging game because as you're moving the tiles over after you score, you'll run into places where you accidentally blocked yourself off, and now you can't put a tile there anymore because you've already got one in that row or that column. So it's a really fun little puzzly game. It's fairly simple and straightforward to play. I think you could teach anybody to play Azul in 5 minutes. But the depth of play is pretty great. It's for, as I said, 2 to 4 players. It is competitive, and you can be very competitive in this game. I play very casually. I only pay attention to my own board and the tiles I want and what I'm doing. But when we play with my parents, my dad is cutthroat, and he'll be counting several turns ahead, saying, okay, if I need these red tiles, or somebody else needs these red tiles, if I take this, then on their turn they'll have to take this because that'll be all that's left. And you can, yeah, it can definitely be very cutthroat, but it's, I think, really great for pretty much anybody.
I see a game called Patchwork, if I remember right.
Yes. Yep.
Yep.
Is that similar to this?
I would say that probably anybody who likes Azul would also like Patchwork. It's Patchwork is another small 2-player game where you're taking polyomino-shaped tiles and trying to fit them into a board. So like Azul, you're trying to fill up your area, but the way of doing it is different. This is doing it through collecting the tiles and then placing one. In Patchwork, you'll be taking the tiles and putting them onto your board. They have the unique shapes, and you have to try and fit them all together as well as possible. Patchwork was actually a game we really wanted to talk about tonight, but it came out in 2015, which is 1 year before our arbitrary cutoff date of 2016. But Patchwork is a phenomenal game.
We do love Patchwork.
Yes.
We were covering the series.
Oh, yeah. So we are moving on to our large games, which is our last section of games to talk about. Our first game is Mansions of Madness, 2nd edition. So a lot of gamers will say you can't do 2nd editions on a top 10 list, but I think you can with this one because it is quintessentially different than the 1st edition. This is a cooperative game where players are playing as investigators, trying to discover the mystery, and all the mysteries are based on the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. So it's very spooky. You are moving through the game, collecting clues, avoiding or fighting monsters, and trying to unravel the mystery of the story. And I say of the story because there are several storylines in the game, the base game itself. What makes this so different than the 1st edition is that it's an app-driven game, which means there's no gatekeeper or dungeon master for the game. The game runs itself, so everyone can participate as a player, and I love that. It keeps track of non-player character health, so it keeps track of all your enemies' health. It also keeps track of board stats, so it really eliminates a lot of the fiddliness of the game in its first conception. There are different scenarios in the game, and each one has a different storyline. All of the tiles in the game are modular, and they're double-sided, which means you build the map as you're going, and the app will tell you how to build it. So the app will say, okay, find living room 14, and you find living room 14 and put it on the board, and they'll tell you what doors to put, what traps to put, everything. So the app really does take care of all of that. It makes it super playable. The theme is, this game is just dripping with theme. You have the little app going, and it has these ominous sound effects in the background as you're playing, which I think really add to the atmosphere. That's something that Brad and I do with all of our games, is we try to put on a soundtrack or some ominous sounds in the background for, like, well, not ominous for all of our games, but for something like Mansions, we would do something ominous. The art is really spooky and dark, and the whole idea of the game is that you're trying to discover these clues before the end of the game, like before the time runs out, before it's too late, before Cthulhu descends upon Arkham, you know? So another really cool thing about the theme is that you have two stats in the game: your sanity and your health. And that's really sticking with H.P. Lovecraft's original writings, because his writings are all about the thin line between sanity and insanity. And when you're fighting monsters and cultists, there's so concern for your health. So I think it's a really cool way to keep track of things, is that you're not just keeping track of your physical health, but you're keeping track of your sanity, which is really in line with H.P. Lovecraft. One of my favorite parts of Mansions of Madness is the puzzles. There is, in some of the mysteries, you have to solve puzzles, which isn't something you really see in a lot of board games. And I thought that was a really cool mechanic. So it could be something as simple as trying to figure out what the combination to a lock is, or trying to figure out these sigils that you have on the game. And I thought that's really cool too. Something else about this game that I think is worth mentioning is that there are a lot of expansions to it. And the expansions, I know it's a huge box and there's expansions. So the expansions add new storylines, they add new characters, and they also add new puzzles and new tiles, also new monsters. The monsters are also really cool, like the components themselves. They're little figures, and they have little cards that slip into the base. So you can have the monster stats right there with the monster. It's a great game. This game is really good for people who enjoy spooky themes, H.P. Lovecraft, solving mysteries, and again, it's a cooperative game. So if you like co-op games and you like storytelling games, this is a great game.
If you've ever played Betrayal at House on the Hill, that's kind of a classic haunted house game. This is like the ultimate version of that. The app-driven aspect is really great. I'm a very low-tech person, so I was very against the idea of needing an app when I first played it. But it's great because as you're exploring, you might only see a small section of the board, but the map is already pre-built in the app, and the app knows where everything is. So it can be moving monsters in the shadows and in the darkness you've not encountered yet. So it's a real inhabited world that you're playing in that you couldn't otherwise do in a game. So it's definitely the best haunted house game that there is.
There is a question that says, does the app make it faster to set up and start?
Absolutely.
The
Yes.
gameplay pictures, the board looks huge.
Yep.
Yes,
Oh,
yes, it definitely does. When you're setting up, you usually only set up 2 to 3 tiles.
Oh, nice.
And so setup is like that.
Yep.
Yeah, we had the first edition Mansions of Madness, and we barely got it to the table because setup was like an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the app controls everything. A lot of times when you roll, somebody will manage the app for the table, and they'll just the app will ask you questions like, "Did you pass or did you fail?" And you'll hit a button, and it does a lot of the upkeep right there in the app for you, eliminating the need to do a lot of the physical things you would normally have to do.
It really streamlined the
Yep.
game.
So, and then my first big game is Star Wars Rebellion. This came out in 2016. It was actually it's one of my favorite games, and it's a grand asymmetric war game for either 2 or 4 players. You are fighting a war that ravages the entire galaxy. It's really Star Wars in a box. When I say asymmetric, when I say that it's an asymmetric grand war game, what I mean is it's a war game for the Empire. The Empire has more military units. They control more planets at the start of the game. They have a stronger economy. They start with a Death Star. They, by all rights, should win the game. The rebels get less of everything. they are not really fighting a war game. They're fighting for survival and for their cause. The rebels' main advantage is that their base is hidden at the start of the game, and the rebels will play by using espionage and subterfuge and making very surgical tactical strikes at just the right moment. Whereas the Empire can afford to fight a war of attrition and just kind of keep hammering at the rebellion. So it's very different depending on which side you're playing, and it's great to play several times and swap sides. The Empire's main goal is to completely eradicate the rebellion, to find their hidden base and destroy it, and the rebels win by gaining enough political support across the galaxy to overthrow the Empire. This game is huge. There are hundreds of small plastic spaceships that come in it. You'll have huge space battles of X-Wings and TIE Fighters and Star Destroyers. You get more cards than you can count. You have handfuls of dice that you'll be rolling, tokens, little standees that represent heroes from the movies like Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, or villains like Boba Fett or Darth Vader. In fact, the heroes and villains will lead missions through different space systems or at different planets, or they'll even lead forces. As I said, so this game is great for either 2 or 4 players. When you play with 2 players, one player controls the Empire and the other the Rebellion. If you play with 4 players, you play on a team. One player on each team takes the role of the admiral of that side, controlling spacecraft and the production of new units. And the other player controls or plays as the general for that side, who conducts the tactical ground warfare and leads groups on missions across the galaxy. This is just a really great game. Anybody who likes science fiction, anybody who likes Star Wars would absolutely love this game. It's just like, as I said, the best Star Wars game that there is.
Many years ago, like the Freedom of the Galaxy,
Yes. Yep. I've heard of Freedom in the Galaxy. I've never played it, but I have seen pictures of it.
You had to move 10 or 11 planets to the edge of the rebellion so that they would all develop at the same time.
Yep.
Otherwise, you'd have to take it off.
I think that was probably an early inspiration for this game. So
we play now modern War of the Ring.
Yes.
And where obviously Sauron controls vast armies everywhere.
Yep.
And you're who you are. Who's against them with a very easy method.
Yes. War of the Ring is actually another one of my favorite games. War of the Ring and Star Wars Rebellion are 2 of my favorite games. We play War of the Ring pretty frequently.
We do.
And
the 10th edition, we have one of the
the collector edition? Oh, I'm so jealous. I look at pictures of that online all the time. So.
We had a very serious debate about whether or not we should get that collector's edition.
We decided not to, but it's I'm very jealous of anyone who has it.
forever.
Or at some point come over and play.
I would love that. That would be amazing. I would love the chance to do that. I think there's actually a final expansion coming out for that for War of the Ring next year. I don't know too much about it. It's just something I've heard while reading about the game, but
I'm not sure I can justify having a third game.
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
So our third big box game is Western Legends. This is a sandbox style game, which means you can do anything. You have a lot of options, and you can be anyone you want to be. You can be good, You can be bad, or you can be neutral. No matter what side of the law you fall on, though, everybody's trying to gain legendary points to get the most points to win, because you want to become a Western legend. If you decide to play a good character, you can collect bounties on the wanted players, you can fight NPC bandits, or you can wrangle cattle and get points for that. If you decide to be a bad character, an outlaw, you can rustle cattle, you can rob your fellow players, or you can rob the bank. But you might get caught by the other players. You also might get caught by the sheriff if the other players decide to send the sheriff to your location. Neutral players can mine gold, they can play poker, they can buy rounds of drinks at the saloon, they can duel other characters. All of these things will get you points in some way. The theme of this game really shines through with the components and the art. As you can see on the box, it's very well themed. They've got those desert reds and the bright blue skies. Each player character board is like a little satchel you would have if you were a person in the Wild West. There's nice little spots on your board where you can keep your cards and keep track of your cards. The general store is great. It's this little shelf that you build, and it fits right into the box, but it just has that feel of the Wild West and being out west. And if you've ever visited a town like Tombstone, Arizona, or Old Tucson, it looks like that on a board. It's phenomenal art. They did a really good job capturing the theme of the Wild West, and also with the actions you can take. It feels like you're playing the part as you're playing the game. So the other thing is with the components is that the cards you play with are poker cards. So when you're fighting, you choose to play poker cards. And when you're playing poker, you play poker cards. So they did a really good job tying in the theme. This game is great, I think, for everyone because there's endless possibilities. Like, you can make any choice in this game. You can start out being an outlaw, and then maybe you get arrested and you get caught by the sheriff, and then you decide you want to go on a redemption arc. So you decide to be a good guy and you follow the martial path. This game is great. You can do anything. I think this also really fills a niche for people who love the Wild West and people who like Wild West folklore and Wild West movies. We definitely had a phase where we were watching a lot of Westerns and we were like, oh, this game is great. So yeah, and I also think it's really good for people who like that sandbox style game where you can do anything.
I also like the Western Legends includes a lot of historic figures. When you play, you're actually playing a real person. It includes famous people like Wyatt Earp, Bass Reeves. I mean, there are dozens of options. I can't remember all of them. But
I think Stagecoach Sally is one.
Okay.
Something like that.
Doc Holliday.
Yeah, Doc Holliday,
Doc
exactly.
Holliday.
Yep. And they all have their own.
Billy the Kid.
And they all start out with their own unique bonuses and play styles. So Billy the Kid will start you on the path of the outlaw. And you can, if you get arrested, it kind of resets your morality. You can choose to be a good guy after that. But it really kind of nudges you in one direction or the other. And on the back side of the character cards, they actually have a historical story about each character. And they really went out of their way to include a lot of representation of people of color, indigenous people that were in the West, women who were in the West, because normally when you hear Western stories, they're about white guys in the West. But so I think it's really interesting that they focused on trying to tell a larger story that showed the picture of the West. And it's kind of funny because actually the last time we played with my parents. My dad was prospecting gold the entire time, and I was an outlaw, and my mom was a marshal, and she and I just kept meeting and dueling, and she was trying to arrest me, and I was trying to rob her, and we came in dead last, and my dad, who was just quietly mining gold in the corner, won by like he had like easily double our score.
It was a war of attrition,
Yeah.
but everybody like stuck to their roles.
Yep.
Everybody's like, nope, I'm gonna be the bad guy, and I'm gonna be the good guy.
And of course we were listening to the soundtrack of something like The Good, the Bad,
The
and
good,
the
the bad, and the ugly.
So my second big game is King's Dilemma, and this is a fairly new game. I think it came out. I think it's from last year. It's for 3 to 5 players, and this is like Game of Thrones in a box. It's not actually tied to Game of Thrones, but it's that style of political setting. You will be in charge of a noble house, and your house will persist through several different eras in this kingdom as you play from session to session. While you're playing, you'll be maintaining your kingdom. You'll be controlling, or you'll be taking actions that will influence the economy, military development, scientific development, quality of life for the people. You'll be voting on things like whether or not you think the kingdom should go to war with your southern neighbors, or if you should or if you should buy iron from the pirates from the coast. It's cheaper, but they're kind of distasteful, so you're not sure if you want to forge that alliance. And as you make these decisions, you'll be voting as a group. People will be having secret meetings in other rooms, texting each other, like, I promise to help you, because everybody has their own agenda. When we were playing a campaign with some of our friends, I was in charge of a house of merchants, and so my goal was to boost the economy of the kingdom to gain more support. So I was doing things like warmongering and doing anything that I saw as having a potential for increasing economic gains. And sometimes my opponents didn't really understand why I would randomly seem to choose one side of an agenda or something, but it was always to try and get that bottom dollar. Another thing you can do is you can debate when you're having your meetings. You'll put the agendas to a vote, and everybody will have to vote one way or the other. You can abstain. But you can bribe each other. You can ask for bribes or ask for money, which is what I would do a lot of times, is just kind of sell my services to the highest bidder. But it's absolutely phenomenal because each house has their own secret agendas where they want things to happen through the history of the kingdom that nobody else is really aware of. And each turn you'll get new goals that nobody else knows. And at the end of each session, you'll be awarded points based on how well you did for your house that turn. If you do really good and you pushed for good advancements, you'll be given, I forget what they're called, but good points. And if you do really bad and you push for evil agendas or things that harm the kingdom, you'll get craven points. And once the entire campaign is over, either from the king dying of old age or the kingdom becoming too unstable from all of the evil things it's done, so there's a revolt, or maybe the kingdom has become too prosperous and the king has decided he no longer needs his advisors and you're kicked to the side. At some point the game will end. When it does, if it's a positive ending, the players with positive points will collectively win. But if it's a negative ending, the single player with the most craven points will win. But since this game takes place over several evenings, it's very hard to keep track of who has good points, who has bad points. And you can have both. So I know you got craven points last time, but I don't know if that it was more than you had good points. So it's very difficult to keep track of people's standings. It's all very kind of in the shadows. Another thing about the King's Dilemma is that it's kind of a legacy style game. Legacy style games are games where you physically alter the game as you play through a campaign. An event might happen and it might instruct you to rip up a card in the deck so that you'll never see that card again. Or you might put a sticker on a space on the board that forever changes how you can interact with that. This game has branching events and storylines, and so any two groups that play will not have the same experience. It will truly be a unique experience by the end of the game. But my absolute favorite part of the game is the diplomacy, the secret meetings, the negotiations. That's where the bulk of this game lies, is those meetings, the discussion. My all-time favorite game is a game called Diplomacy, which came out a number of years ago. It was actually JFK's favorite board game, and he would force his cabinet members to play with him. And that's another game where you have secret meetings. You discuss movements around pre-World War I Europe. That's something that this game makes me think of. But this game takes that concept and just makes something absolutely huge and tremendous out of it. But that's the King's Dilemma.
So there are a lot more games that we love that we cannot talk about because we'd be here forever. But you can visit the book garden anytime, and we're all happy to talk about board games, give recommendations, and you can even check out our Facebook or check the front of the store window for our schedule. We are going to start board game nights again, and so we'll keep an update on that. You can give us a call if you want and see when we're going to schedule those. And yeah, we're always happy to talk about board games, happy to play board games, and it sounds like you two need to set up a day where you play Diplomacy and War of the Ring.
Yep.
And then we're going to open it up to questions.
Not a question, just used to drive me nuts. Mike would play with his office mates back in DC, and I'd be in the kitchen, and that was where the secret, one of the
Yeah.
you know, someone who would fall for the promise.
Yep.
Every time. Oh, okay, this time you really won't betray me?
Yep.
Oh, I'm gonna give you that game.
7 rather combative lawyers.
Oh.
All of them were working for EPA and long-term fighting U.S. Steel. And they come home from a trial.
Yeah. Yep.
That sounds like a more intense diplomacy game than I've ever played.
In the capital of diplomacy. I will tell you a story which I believe to be true, but I don't quite sure.
Okay.
My mother's brother married Chester Gold's daughter. Chester Gold was the senator of the state, and he was senator from Connecticut. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy wanted to calm down and he told him Chester Gold, and his brother Bobby and half a dozen others and played diplomacy to capture the My grandparents had a copy of Diplomacy, which they gave to me when they died, which they got from Chester Gold.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's
They
amazing.
always said that it was the game that had to play physically, be in the board and then play during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's really amazing.
Wow.
That's
Now, I
amazing.
have no way to ensure somebody busting at their fingerprints and stuff.
Sometimes I think those stories are just worth believing in because it's just such an amazing idea to think that. Yes.
Yes.
That's I read somewhere that one reason that people like collecting autographs so much is because when you look at an autograph, you're standing in the same person that somebody else was. And I feel like that's kind of similar to buying a game like that. You're sitting around a game that somebody else was sitting around making decisions over. So that's a really amazing story.
I think it may well be true. There's no reason why it couldn't.
Yep.
It's not that way. It's not that way.
Yeah.
So what are some other favorite games of yours, going just all over the map time-wise, not just a passport, but
So, two of my favorite games we did talk about was Patchwork. I love Patchwork. It is just one of those. I actually just bought the Halloween edition. And I also really love Arkham Horror, which is another Fantasy Flight H.P. Lovecraft story. And that one to me I like because it is a modular board, and you can so that means you can move the different street districts around, and it's kind of like the same thing where you're trying to solve a mystery, and you're trying to defeat the monsters, and each one has a different scenario, and it doesn't have the app, which after playing Mansions of Madness with the app, I'm like, I think all games should have an app. But I think those are two of my favorites.
A lot of my favorite games are war games, or games that are kind of war games. I really like Hannibal Rome vs. Carthage. And that's a really fun historic game where one person plays Hannibal and is trying to lead the elephants up through the Alps, and the other player is the Romans trying to defend Rome from the Carthaginians. And I've read quite a few books on the Punic Wars, and I think that it actually does a pretty good job. There are event cards that happen that directly correlate to events that actually happened. There are a lot of you can do things like you can try and get the Greeks to come to your aid. You can sack different cities for different benefits. Different generals are available to different sides, and some of them will come in later through the game. One aspect I really like is that the Romans actually have pretty poor generals, because the Roman generals were actually political appointees in that era, and a lot of them had no right to be leading militaries, and there were always two appointed, and they would usually argue because they wanted to be the one that was the hero. So they would often take turns leading, and neither would be very effective. One would say, today we're marching west, and then the next day the other one would be leading and say, well, today we're marching east. So that's one of my favorite games. I also really like Twilight Struggle, which is a 2-player Cold War game where you also play event cards. You're trying to stage coups in different politically unstable countries. You're trying to lock down control of different areas. You're trying for the space race. You play by playing event cards, which have either a USSR or American event on them. And if you play an event that's not necessarily good for you, it can be quite devastating. But just seeing the history, I really like games with very strong history in them.
Viticulture. We can't leave without talking about Viticulture.
Yes.
That is probably one of our favorite games to play. You are a vineyard owner, and it's a worker placement, and you're trying to gather your grapes, make your wine, and sell your wine. And it is just a lovely game to play. We usually try to put on an Italian soundtrack and
open a
bottle of wine, and then just play a game about making wine.
Yep.
And it's competitive, but it's relaxing. You don't care how many victory points you get. You're just trying to make the best wine you can.
Especially after you've had.
Especially after you've drank a bottle of wine.
But that's actually made by the same publisher as Wingspan. So they make some of the best games that have come out. They've also made Scythe and a few other really large titles in recent years. years. But out of all the Stonemaier games, I would say Viticulture is my
Viticulture.
favorite.
Yep.
So.
What's the wolf one?
Oh, One Night Ultimate Werewolf.
That was
Yes.
one with Arkham with 7 people.
Yep.
We really played that one, and that has an app too.
It
Yes.
does. Yep.
Kind of it's simple. The app feature is pretty simple, but it's really fun.
We did want to talk about that.
We did.
Diplomacy is one I would highly suggest even for the library. I think like a diplomacy club would be really cool. So that's
And you can teach people how to play diplomacy in 15 minutes.
yeah, there are only 4 possible actions you can take, so it's very simple. It's all about the negotiations, and that's.
It's one of those games that it's simple mechanically,
But there's a lot
but
of depth.
conceptually, it's very deep.
But back to One Night Ultimate Werewolf. That's
Yeah.
that's also a game that we really do like. It's very short. It has the app. It only has a few components. It's like classic werewolf or mafia games where you have an uninformed majority and an informed minority that is actively working against the majority. The difference is in classic werewolf or mafia, the game is played over several evenings or rounds, and somebody is assassinated in the night over each round. And that means that there's player elimination. People are eliminated from the game. They have to wait 10 or 15 minutes to get into the next game.
And there's a storyteller.
And there's a storyteller.
So they're out of the game the whole game.
With One Night Ultimate Werewolf, the app controls it, and there's only one round where everybody gets a chance to wake up in the middle of the night and do their special ability and then go back to sleep. And then everybody wakes up at the same time, and then you have to try and piece together who the werewolf is. The werewolf, or the person who thinks they're the werewolf, is trying to cast doubt by saying, no, I'm not the werewolf. I'm pretty sure I heard him get up and move in the middle of the night. He's the werewolf, not me. But the thing is, the different roles, like you do things like trade identities with people, and they might not even know. So maybe I started out as the werewolf, and Becky was the trickster, so she woke up in the night and she traded my role with him. So I'm trying to cast doubt on him because I think I'm the werewolf. I don't want to be found out, but come to find out he's actually now the werewolf. So it's a really chaotic, crazy game.
Yes.
7 times in a row.
But it's great. Games last 5 or 10 minutes. You can play a lot of games in a row. Nobody's eliminated. There's a lot of laughter when you're playing. It's a really fun game. We like to take it camping with us. Our favorite place to play is next to the campfire on a picnic table in the middle of the night with the spooky music playing in the background.
Yep.
It's a lot of fun.
We're suckers for atmosphere.
What's that?
How old are your?
Oh, we don't have kids yet. When we talk about our family, we mean my parents as well. So we're the kids.
We're the kids.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and thanks everybody online for listening in. Questions?
Turn the stop recording.